In March of 1862, Fort Monroe would send a telegraph to Washington, D.C., informing it that their brand new warship proved a resounding success when tested under enemy gunfire. However, 9 months later, Fort Monroe would send another telegraph to Washington, D.C., informing it that this warship had been lost in a storm. On January 3, 1863, Secretary of the United States Navy, Wells, would receive the information and would write, "She is the primary representative of a class identified with my administration of the Navy. Her novel construction and qualities I adopted, and she was built amidst obloquy and ridicule. But the board which I appointed seconded my views, and were willing to recommend the experiment if I would incur the risk and responsibility. Her success with the Merrimac directly after she went into commission relieved me of odium and anxiety, and the men who were preparing to ridicule were left to admire." The next day, on January 4th, 1863, the first newspaper articles about the Monitor's loss were published, and the information was quite interesting. The New York Times would write, "A dreadful disaster. Foundering of the Monitor off Cape Hatteras, 2 officers and 38 men lost." The New York Herald would write, "The Monitor foundered, the famous ironclad gunboat lost off Cape Hatteras, 4 officers and 12 men missing." Now, the New York Herald was obviously far more accurate in its loss count rather than the New York Times, since only 16 men had been lost in the Monitor's sinking, rather than the 40 stated in the New York Times. To carry on with the New York Herald's report, "That invaluable cheesebox on a raft, this favorite little ship, her loss is the loss of the pet of the people." Though January 4th is the first time the news had spread amongst the public, the news would not really take off in rapid speed until the next day on January 5th, when more newspapers picked up the story and began publishing it, and to spare everybody the repetitive writings, these articles would carry on informing the public that Monitor sunk off Cape Hatteras with a loss of 16 men for the next couple of weeks. What's very interesting about a lot of these newspapers in the weeks following Monitor's loss is that they would write about the ship having been sunk, and then on the next page you would see an advertisement for a kerosene or coal-burning stove, whichever your preference was, which was the USS Monitor stove. This was a stove made before the Monitor was sunk to look like Monitor, since the Monitor was essentially a mascot for the United States military. However, common opinion is it was not very tactful to advertise this item while also talking about the actual ship being sunk and men being killed during the event. Amidst all the newspaper articles about the Monitor sinking and advertising the stove, on January 10th, 1863, the Evening Press would publish an article titled, "Still Afloat, Our Monitor Has Not Sunk." Then it would go on to write, "History has already made the name immortal, and the destruction of the original Monitor cannot destroy its prestige." The words here hit real hard, since the North would not forget the Monitor very quickly, and the ship would still find itself celebrated for its immense successes in March of 1862, and then of course the offspring that it would produce, since the United States government would order 60 Monitors during the Civil War, with 37 of those being completed before the war's end. So what was the South's opinion on the loss of the Monitor? The news in the South had spread just as fast as it did in the North, since both the North and the South had spies in both locations, and this meant that information was easily accessible and could spread fast amongst your enemies. The South was quite happy that Monitor was taken out, since they no longer had to deal with this obstacle, and ideally it put them in a better position having at least one less Monitor on the field, even though the United States was pumping out a couple more at the very moment Monitor was sinking. To effectively sum up the South's thought, they took note that the Monitor had sunk, however they had new worries to concern, so they quickly moved on. Now let's switch our attention back to the United States government. Since the news of the Monitor sinking had already spread rapidly, now a new question had to arise. Should the United States Navy look for the Monitor's wreck, and, if possible, should they attempt recovering it? Uniquely, for how big the Monitor's name was, and for how much of a propaganda piece the ship really was, the United States government did not put any effort into looking for the wreck at all. Captain Bankhead, who was the Monitor's final commander, made an official report where he estimated that Monitor sank in approximately 300 feet of water, which in 1862 and 1863 diving technology terms, this depth was inaccessible as far as salvage efforts are concerned, so this means that if the Navy did find the wreck, they wouldn't be able to salvage it. However, it has to be acknowledged that Captain Bankhead's estimation could be wrong, and it was, so if they put effort into finding the wreck and it was within salvageable terms, would it be worth salvaging? Consensus said no. The Monitor only had two 11-inch Dahlgren guns, which were very slow at firing, and the ship's machinery was revolutionary for the time period. However, it still had a long list of flaws. This meant that the United States government was not really interested in recovering the ship, since it was not that valuable of an asset, since they were already making more. It's also worth mentioning that the newer monitors being constructed were faster, more maneuverable, and had better firepower, as at least one gun in the new monitors was a 15-inch Dahlgren. They outclassed the Monitor in every respect. The only search missions the United States Navy would carry out following the Monitor's loss was to attempt finding the 16 missing men, as they could have survived the sinking and just not been picked up. However, they were never found. So by this point, the public is well aware Monitor is sunk, the government has no interest in finding it, and the United States Navy can't find any of the 16 missing men. So this means that it is now time to move on from the Monitor. Though its name is not forgotten in the United States, it was no longer the front page news, since there was still a major civil war occurring. With that being said, that is all that has to be said on this topic for today. So, if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day.